Hello, my name is Eric Siegel, and I am one of the pastors at the Village Church. The following podcast is a ministry of the Village Church. We hope that it inspires you, that it draws you closer to Jesus, and it opens your eyes to the possibilities of living in the kingdom. Enjoy, and God bless. Carry on the announcements. Yeah, that's my job. Let's pray, guys. Jesus, thank you so much for today. Thank you that even just a few of us can gather here to sing and to talk about you and to reflect on what you're doing. And I just ask that for those of people who've watched, the people who are involved this morning, as we wrestle with the same text, that I just ask that you would knock down the barriers in our heart and that we would be open to the transformation that you're inviting us into. Give us peace and give us grace for one another as we just kind of work things out. And we ask that in your holy name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right. So I don't have slides, so if you could just drop your slide down, would be great. Thanks. Okay, so I know all of you have rules, and if you're a parent, you have, or all of you been kids, so you have rules. You had rules when you were in your family. But like at my house, there were a set of rules that applied to our house. And then when we went to other people's houses, you were supposed to obey their rules. But you were supposed to obey the rules of our house. So that was added on top. So if you went to somebody's house where jumping on the couch was okay, you still didn't get to jump on their couch because our house rule was no jumping on the couch. So you didn't get that kind of freedom. So my question is, what kind are some of the rules that you live by in your life? Like, what are some of the things that seem to drive your life? And I'm not talking about the kinds of rules that are, let's just say, for lack of a better word, the moral rules. Like, not the do not murder. Like, what kind of rules just drive you in your life that you have for yourself and you have for other people? So I'm just going to take a moment, since there's a few of us, and see if you can give me some of the rules that you think you live your life by at this point in time. I need to sleep 8 hours every night. Rule. That's a good rule. Anybody else have any rules? You have we have a lot of relational rules, right? Do people have relational rules? This, I will be treated X, Y, and Z, or else. Yes, right. How about, do you have rules that have consequences? Like, you don't do this. Like, tell me one rule you have for someone else and the consequence that you have for that rule if they violate it. Oh, don't punch me, or I'll punch you. Okay, that's a good one. Well, there you go. There is a correct way to load. It's kind of crazy that everybody's correct way is different, but yeah, theirs is wrong, right? See, and here we are beginning to illustrate. Interesting, just to give an example where we're kind of going. Like for me, like I have rules, obviously, like rules for my kids. You will be obedient, but more importantly, I have added rule of you will not embarrass me in public. Like that's the more important rule than them being obedient, in a sense, is you will not embarrass me. We have these, and I want you just to think about these rules that you have, and maybe this has triggered sort of your thoughts a little bit. And I would encourage you to think about, as you reflect on your rules, what kind of things do people do or you do that bring about kind of anger and contempt, either for yourself, like so self-contempt, or contempt for other people, or anger at other people. Like, what kinds of things do people do that kind of produce that kind of emotion, or that you even do, and that'll give you a sense of what kind of rules you have, right, that you hold over people. So we're in this series on encountering Jesus, and we decided that we would go through the Gospel of Mark, take 8 stories, and look at those 8 stories and sort of wrestle with them, but not just so that we can wrestle with them over this, next 8 weeks or so, but we really want to kind of massage them into our life over the year. We want to come back as we wrestle with things in our life. We want to come back and be like, oh my gosh, this is a lot like being on the boat in the storm. Like we can begin to think our life through on a grid of these different encounters. Now, the thing that we've learned about Jesus at this point in time and about kind of us growing towards Jesus is that where transformation happens is in our disruption and our interruption, right? That's where Jesus tends to stand in our life. And that's where we can find him in the most intense way. That's where we can experience a transforming is in our disruption and the interruption of our life, right? And so today, we're not going to look at, the crazy storm. We're not going to look at him straightening out somebody's hand. We're not going to look at him healing the paralyzed man and forgiving his sin or changing someone's entire vocation. We're actually going to look at Jesus as a teacher. And William Barclay, one of the commentators of the 20th century, like one of the most famous ones, says that this particular passage is one of the most revolutionary passages in the New Testament. And the reason he says it is not because it's more profound than Jesus' death and resurrection, but he says this because of how it turns the thinking of the people of Israel upside down and how he counters the very idea that is the foundation of who they are. So we're going to get into it. You heard it read, but we'll read it again. It's in Mark chapter 7. Mark is the second gospel or biography in the New Testament. To just give you the context, because it's important here, is the bottom of chapter 6, Jesus has walked on water, relatively miraculous. He's getting off the boat, and people are coming from everywhere, and they're just wanting to grab onto his cloak. His ministry has gotten really big. People are coming from everywhere. And that's sort of where we pick up the story, at least in the way that Mark is telling it. So, chapter 7, verse 1 starts this way. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? All right, so to give you a little bit of the context, at least what I think, if you remember for this first 7 chapters or so, at least the encounters that we've looked at, there has been what we've called the certification board, the Pharisees and scribes, and they've been asking Jesus questions. And in fact, we found that they've gotten to the point where they want to get rid of him. And the reason they want to get rid of him, he's challenging their authority with the people, and he's drawing bigger crowds, and he's saying things that seem a little contradictory to what they're saying. There's a little clue in this text, and I know I'm reading into it, but at the very beginning, it says that some Pharisees and scribes came down from Jerusalem. I think Jesus' ministry is getting so big and so widespread that the junior certification board, the board that says, hey, it's okay to listen and follow this rabbi, has gone up to Jerusalem and asked for the big guns. And now the big guns have come down to kind of look at what's going on and really go after him. And the first thing that they observe is that people are not washing their hands properly, right? And they're not following this tradition of men. Now, how do we know that the Gospel of Mark is not written to Jews, but is written to Gentiles? Well, there are lots of what we call parentheses with long explanations as to why this is even important. So we got a long explanation of this is why it would be important for Jews to clean their hands. So I want to give you a little background about how Israel works and why these traditions are important. And really, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, as a historian, it's kind of fascinating as to how Israel managed to stay together for thousands of years while other nations disappeared. This little people managed to grow, expand and what's the other word when you contract? Thank you. Contract, expand, but managed to hold a cohesive identity through a big chunk of history. And the reason that is that they believe, number one, that they're God's chosen people, but it's built around God giving Moses the law, this law being the thing that holds them together. So in the Old Testament, if you read books like Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers, you find out about what this law is and the narrative of the law. But I would like to just give you a very fast overview and help you understand what's happening in this conversation as it expands out. So the law that's handed down from God to Moses and Moses to the Israelites can be divided into three parts. Part number one is the moral law. It's what you and I would call the 10 Commandments and some other commands, but just for the sake of conversation right now, it's the moral law, the 10 Commandments. You shouldn't have any other God before me. You shouldn't take God's name in vain. You should honor your mother and father. You shouldn't commit adultery. You shouldn't steal. You shouldn't covet. Right? There's these moral laws. They're what govern everything, right? And they're laid out. And this is what God expects, and this is how you live life rightly. That's the moral law. Now there's the civil law, which, depending on how, and people divide this out differently, but for me, and I like it this way, the civil law is explaining to the Israelites in particular how they live out the moral law in society, okay? So, for instance, there are things in the moral law like if your ox bores someone to death, this is what happens. If it gets out again and does the same thing, this is what happens. If you try to dig out your neighbor's donkey and it doesn't work and you kill your neighbor's donkey and you're trying to help him, this is what the consequences are, right? So, and it is this whole conversation about how you live out life together in the context of the moral law. Now, as followers of Jesus, we hold on to the moral law, and we actually take a lot of the principles from the civil law. But the civil law is directed to Israel in particular about how they're going to live their life. And the reason that that's so important is they were slaves in Egypt. They came out of Egypt, and God called them to be separate. And so he laid out exactly what separate would look like. And if you do any kind of study of the moral and civil law, you will see how it is counterpoint to the Canaanite religions all around Israel. But there is a third part of the law, and it's a big chunk of it. And it's what we call the ceremonial law. And the ceremonial law has two kinds of things in it. One, it has what you do when you touch mold. What you do if you have, this is interesting, what you do if you're balding, right? Because you may be unclean if you're balding, sorry. There's things like that, some obscure things in that, but it's dealing with what makes you clean and what makes you unclean. And the other part of it is about how you pay for breaking the moral law, right? And what it's built around is sacrifices. It's where all the festivals are, where all the sacrifices are. And what is being made clear in the ceremonial law is that you, Israelites, and us, but you, Israelites, don't get to determine what makes you clean or unclean. God determines what makes you clean and unclean. And God is the one who determines what makes you right before him, not you. And here's the process, and it has to do with death. So it's very clear within the ceremonial law that if you sin, meaning you break the moral law, there has to be a sacrifice to pay for your sin. Right? And this is all built into the ceremonial law. Now, in the moral law, civil law, ceremonial law, and the prophets, there is this pointing to Jesus because there's this indication that you can't keep the law and someone is coming to complete the law. Someone is coming to complete the ceremonial part of it, to be sacrificed for all of us. It's very clear in there. These ideas and this law, and it really isn't that big, this small codex has kept Israel together for a very long time and has given them an identity and a way of being separate. What's happening in this text is that this tradition has been added to it. And it's hand washing and many other things. And so a couple of weeks ago, Mark talked about Sabbath, and right, one of the 10 Commandments is that the seventh day should be rest. You should have Sabbath, right? But how do you do that? Well, they have all these rules about what is actual work on Sabbath, and that's the tradition. But they also have how you wash your hands, and they have all these other things. And so during Jesus' time, probably 100 years before and then 100 years after, there was a lot of this tradition being built. And by 100 years after Jesus, it was all coalesced into what we call the Mishnah. And so you can understand the procedure that these disciples and Jesus was talking about when it comes to hand washing, I thought I'd read to you a compelling reading from the Mishnah about how to wash your hands so that you know exactly what's going on. Okay, so here we go. A minimum of a quarter of a log of water must be poured over the hands of one person, and even for two. A minimum of half a log must be poured over the hands of 3 or 4 persons. Water may be poured over the hands out of any kind of vessel, even out of vessels made of animal dung, out of vessels made of stone, or out of vessels made of clay. Water may not be poured from the sides or out of broken vessels or from the bottom of a ladle or a stopper of a jar. Nor may one pour water over the hands of his fellow out of his cupped hands, because one may not draw, nor sanctify, nor sprinkle the water of purification, nor pour water over the hands except in a vessel, and only vessels closely covered with a lid protecting their contents from uncleanliness. Okay, so compelling. So this is all the things that are tradition, the way that you're supposed to clean yourself before you eat. And here's all of the things that they have built up as a tradition. To kind of have the context of what these Pharisees are saying is like, you guys are not following the traditions, the way we set it out. This is how we do it. Right? And Jesus, only dialoguing with the Pharisees and the scribes, says this. He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. That they worship me in vain, but their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. So Jesus says, look, here is the problem. Let me just diagnose you. And he says this in other places in a much simpler way and just calling them whitewashed tombs, right? They're nice on the outside, but they're death on the inside. Here he's just like, all right, you guys on the outside pay lip service, but inside your heart is messed up. And here's how I know your heart is messed up. It's by the symptoms that you are demonstrating to me. And he says, here's how it works. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God, the moral law, in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, 10 commandments. And then he says, anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban, that is a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition, and you have that you've handed down, and you do many things like that. So here's what they were doing. They were taking their estates and they were saying, oh, my whole estate is Corban, meaning when I pass on, I'm going to give it to God. It's God's, right? I'm not passing it down to my family or anything like that. So then when mom and dad need help, what you say to mom and dad is, I'm sorry, but I have declared everything I own to be God's, and I can't actually give you anything because it's God's, and I couldn't take from God to give to you. Oh, but by the way, I'm going to benefit from it until I die. And so what they've done is they've completely circumvented the law, the very way it's supposed to be, in order for them to do what they want, right? To make things work for them. And it's not just that they're doing it here. He says that they've done it in a whole bunch of different ways. And if you read the New Testament, you find out they're doing this with divorce. They're doing it with everything. Right? They are following the traditions of men that help give them power and control. And what Jesus says is, it's not what you're doing, it's something's wrong with your heart. So that's what he tells the leaders. And here's the symptom. Here's what the evidence of there's something wrong with your heart. So the first people he talks to in this passage are the Pharisees. The second people that he addresses are the crowds. And it says in verse 14, again, Jesus called the crowds to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, It is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. Now, number one, we're going to find out when Jesus addresses the disciples that the disciples are confused about this tiny little parable. And I have to be honest, I would be confused about this part of the parable too. Because what I hear Jesus saying is, okay, what I eat and what I touch, that's not what's going to make me unclean, but what comes out of me, that's going to be unclean. And I know that what comes out of me is unclean. So there we go. That's what he's talking about. And also this week, my sink clogged up. And the reason that my sink clogged up in the kitchen is that my wife decided to pour vegetable soup down the garbage disposal. And it, clogged the sink. Vegetable soup didn't look that unclean, but once the plumber had come and cleaned everything out, it's the kitchen sink. So it was just black stuff, right, all over the place. So unclean, went in, clean, came out unclean. It seems like that would, they're going to be confused, and I want to give them an out because he does say some hard things to them, but it's not necessarily clear. But I also want you to understand what Jesus is doing here when he talks to the crowds, and it's really, really important. Because all through Mark, he's talking about seeds, and he gives a lot of illustrations and parables about seeds. But Jesus is in the process of planting seeds. If you go to Matthew chapter 11, there's at the end of chapter 11, there's this part where Jesus tells the crowds, come to me, my burden is light. The burden you're carrying is heavy. Come to me, my burden is light. But the indication when he says that is that he looks out at the crowds and has compassion on them because of the burden that they're carrying. And it's the burden of the Pharisee and the scribe with all these traditions and rules on top of them. The seed that Jesus is planting here for the crowds is saying, hey guys, like all the rules about what makes you clean and unclean, I'm just going to wipe them away right here. I'm going to plant a seed so that when my Spirit comes, when I ascend into heaven and send the Holy Spirit, that seed I just planted is going to spring into a community. You're going to understand what I'm talking about here. Now, I think that's really, really important because you sometimes wonder, why did the church spread so fast? Well, it's because Jesus spent 3 years planting seeds and preparing the community of God to have the Spirit of God poured out on them. So he has compassion on them, and he offers them this opportunity to be in relationship. Now, I think you need to, for us, being clean and unclean doesn't necessarily make sense. I mean, I have teenagers, or I have a teenage boy, so unclean and clean is a debatable thing as to if he's ever clean, right? And, I don't know, and all of us have different relationships with showers, but, and how much we like them or not. Like, so the cleanliness, it can get confusing, but really what it has to do with is relationship. What the Pharisees are saying is, if you do all the traditions and you do it right and you figure it out, then you can be in. You can be in relationship with the people of God, and you can be in relationship with God. If you don't follow those things, you're out. You're not in relationship. There's division and a block there, right? And so what Jesus is saying, no. To be in relationship with me and one another, it doesn't matter what you touch and how you eat things. It's about something that's going on inside of you. So the disciples don't understand this. And so once they get inside, they have a conversation with him. It says, starting in verse 17, his disciples asked him about this parable. And he says to them, are you so dull? Now, I've read this a lot because, I've been a Christian a long time, and I read this in Gospel of Mark, and I think, why is Jesus saying, are you so dull? He's being so hard on them. Jesus isn't being hard. It's the same thing when he's saying, where's your faith? What he's saying to them is, I just walked on water. I fed people. I calmed the storms. I straightened out somebody's hand. Levi, you used to be a crazy tax collector, and now you're hanging out with me. Do you guys still don't get it? You don't understand what I'm talking about? Like, it's not like, are you dull and stupid? It's just like, man, it's going to be a lot of work for me to get through to you guys, is what he's saying. Do you not actually have faith? Do you not really think I am who I am? And he could walk away in that moment. But what's interesting is you could think that in a way they are unclean. They don't get it. And he could say, fine, I'm not going to have a relationship with you. But instead he says, no, let me explain it to you. He says, don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then into his body. Okay, now here comes one of those parentheses. In saying this, Jesus declares all foods clean. Well, we may not understand that, but there's this conversation when the Gospel of Mark is being written about Jewish food laws, and the Greeks who are in the church who don't know anything about the right things and the wrong things to eat, and they eat all the wrong things, and they eat them in unclean ways. And Mark is making sure that the church, as they read this, know, okay, here's the moment when Jesus himself says, all food is clean. Eat some bacon-wrapped shrimp. That's because that would be terrible if you were Jewish, right? The bacon-wrapped shrimp. Because, the shrimp has toxins and bacon has toxins. And it's delicious. He went on. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. From within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside the man and make a man unclean. Now, so Jesus explains it's not about the food, it's not about how you clean your hands, it's not about what you touch, it's about what comes out of your heart. And when he says comes out of your heart are a complete violation of the Hebrew moral law, right? The 10 Commandments. If you look at these, I like calling these the Pauline bad guys, because Paul loves to pull these out in his letters and say, this is what it is that is not good, right? Don't do these things. Jesus rarely pulls them out, but he pulls them out and says, here it is. This is what's in your heart. This is what makes you unclean. There is something wrong with you, and you can't do anything about it, right? Because what the Jewish people are trying to do through their tradition and through their attempts to follow the law is to keep themselves clean and in relationship with God. And what Jesus is saying is, no. You can't do it. Your heart is so messed up and that you will just compulsively violate the moral law. You will violate the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments will continually point out that there's a heart issue with you. Right? Now, if the disciples aren't dull at this moment when they hear this, and they can remember their good prophets in the Old Testament, what kind of the bell that would start going off is that they would think, oh yeah, Ezekiel talks about this. The prophet in the Old Testament, Ezekiel, talks about this. In Ezekiel 36:26 through 29, he says this, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone, the heart that is compulsively going the opposite direction of God, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. And I love verse 29. I will save you from all your uncleanness. So what Ezekiel said is that there is this moment coming when God is going to remove our heart of stone, the one that produces all of that sexual immorality, theft, lewdness, dishonoring of our parents, all those things that we just seem to not be able to do. He's going to replace that with a new heart. He's going to give us his spirit. And what is the spirit going to do? Move us. The Spirit of God is the one that's going to move us towards following the law, and he's going to save us and make us clean. So what Jesus is doing right in this moment is saying, look, Israel, you have spent all this time trying to figure out how to do it right. You're not going to figure it out. You're not going to be able to keep your laws because there's something broken in you. And the rest of Mark is going to be this narrative of how Jesus is setting up himself up as the person who's going to die on the cross, raised from the dead, and bring about this new heart and this new way of being with his spirit. Now, Paul kind of gives us a little bit of commentary on this in 2 Corinthians 3:17. He says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So as we look back at what is being said here to the disciples, as we encounter Jesus' teaching on the law and what makes us unclean, we know that if we embrace Jesus and we follow Jesus, that if we have the Spirit of God, we have freedom. And Paul in Romans 6:18 says, you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. What he's saying there is just along with what Jesus was saying. Your heart of stone, right? This compulsive behavior to just violate the moral law, you were enslaved to it. But now because of what Christ has done on the cross and Christ's Spirit in you, you are now not a slave to what is good and right and clean. So you're in relationship with God, and now you are learning and practicing what it means to be clean. You can actually deal with it, right? You can actually begin to move towards the way God wants things to be. So with that said, when we look at a passage like this, where we're not in the place of the Pharisees, we're not in the place of the crowd, and we're not in the place of the disciples because we have the Spirit of God, what does a passage like this then say to us? What is the encounter that we need to wrestle with? Well, I think it's at some level the same encounter that the Pharisees and the crowds and the disciples had. And that is, we have to deal with our legalism. We have to begin to think about it and break it down and adjust it. And so I do want to have a little conversation about that, but first let me just provoke you, I hope, in thinking about the rules that you have and what they do. Okay? Because the Pharisees' rules were built around control, and they were built to control other people, right? And to give them self-position. And you and I have these rules. So think about the rules that you have for relationship with other people, right? What rules do you have with them? We talked about this, but we have rules in a political area. I can't be in relationship or trust someone who believes X, Y, and Z, right? We have these when it comes, I love what Ashley said, we have these in our relationship, right? You have to treat me this way or you will get a consequence, right? We have rule sets in our relationships, but it goes even further than that. We have these rules. I think we have these rules not just for other people. We have them for ourselves. And in fact, if you've grown up in a Christian family or in the church, you develop these rules. You naturally kind of go the route of the Pharisees and produce a lot of traditions. And you put them on yourself, and you're like, if I do X, Y, and Z, then I'll be okay with God, and then I can talk to God, and then everything will be okay with God, right? Or if I just, if I stop this sin and stop this sin, then I will be okay. And what happens is we fail at those things, and there's a tyranny of shame and guilt that we live under as people, right? So we have rules for ourselves. And all these things produce a brokenness in our relationship with people. But it can go even further. You can kind of filter it even down further. If you're depressed, you have rules when you're depressed, right? One rule is don't tell me I'm not depressed, right? That's a rule. Or I'm depressed, I can't do that. Because people who are depressed don't do those things, right? Or if we're anxious, we have rules. We control, right? We have rules. I live by rules. Like one I expressed to you earlier, and I think it's one that parents wrestle with, but it's a rule I've always had for my kids, and it's not a good one, and I have to keep pulling it out and trying to have the rule that God has given me, which is grace, but that is not that you obey, but that you don't embarrass me. That's my rule. And there are punishments and consequences relationally if you embarrass me, right? And that is detrimental to people around me. And it is something that I easily slip into. So what I'd like to talk about with you guys, and since there's just a few of me, maybe a few of you, maybe we can have a bit more of a engaging conversation. But let's go back to the beginning, but what are the rules that you have, and how have they been damaging to both you and the people around you? I suppose we should have a mic.
So I was thinking about this as you were talking as like a more concrete example than just kind of generally.
Sure.
So the rules I have is that if someone doesn't contact me to spend time with me, then they don't want to hang out with me and I'm not going to reach out to them. And I think that is something that a lot of us do. That, we long for a relationship just within the greater community. And, we have these rules of like, and half the time you don't even realize you have the rule.
Right.
And, thinking through like, wanting relationships with people in our church and then, realizing that, the phone works both ways. I can reach out, but I think there's this rule of like, well, they're not pursuing me, so why should I pursue them?
Right.
And I think that's been, that can be really isolating in a community. And, I know I've felt isolated and I'm sure others have as well. So that's something that definitely I'm going to be challenged by going forward. So
Thanks, Ashley. Anybody else? The thoughts about rules?
The thing I kept coming back to after the sermon this morning was the unspoken ones. Like, how do I tell when that rule is being broken? Going back to like when I get angry, that rule has been broken. That those often, when I recognize it, it's usually like, oh, if the anger happens quickly, then this is a rule that I have more, that I hold more closely, that I need to be breaking down. But if that's kind of a slow burn and it's my daughter like banging on something for a little while and I want her to be quiet, it's when that anger kind of comes up that I go, oh, hey, there's something else happening here.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah. Rod has a comment.
When I was first ordained to be a church planter, they sat on the bedside in our hotel room and they were concerned that I could abandon my wife and children for the sake of the gospel, which hit me like a ton of bricks. And I said, oh, no, that would never happen. And they turned to Kathy and said, could that happen? And she said, oh, yeah. I could get so excited about the ministry and the work with other people that I'd look past the people I love. And there's a presumption in that they will be okay and they don't need me and all of that. And that has just has been something I've had to wrestle with all my life of, and I made a rash vow at that time, like, okay, your day off will be my day off and I will spend time with you and I will not look past you. And it's good. And it's been hard to honor that. And I think that was the really, but it was a moment in time where I realized my sin of always looking beyond the people who are close to me.
Okay. Anybody else? Thoughts?
Similar to yours. I had this great meeting with Betsy, and how can I contact her again? Because I want to meet with her again. She was going to see her daughter get married. How did it go in California? Because I don't know. So how do I contact Betsy? I don't know. I'll have to try to look at my phone and see if I can reach Betsy.
Well, we can give you Betsy's phone number.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's so true. It's true.
You know, rules are interesting because they are simultaneously really easy and really difficult, because following them is difficult. It takes discipline, it takes obedience, it takes commitment, and it's very difficult. But from a a spiritual logical standpoint, it's actually a lot easier to have rules than to not have rules and just kind of go about your life in an ambiguous, I don't know what to, I'm gonna listen to Jesus instead of follow rules on a case by case basis. That's hard. That's wildly hard. And so we both have this propensity to follow rules and say, okay, well, instead of actually pursuing relationship, because that's hard, I'm going to put rules and I'm going to just adhere to those, which is not good. And then, the other side of that is, not good either, of just.
Right.
So I don't know. Rules are interesting because we all have them, and I don't know if we should, and maybe we should have more. And I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's difficult.
Well, I think the invitation is to still have God's rules. And I think the accusation that Jesus has against the Pharisees is that they've abandoned, honor your father and mother, and gone to what's to their advantage. So, and I think for God, I think the moral or the law clearly is communicating that the rules are there to promote relationship and promote intimacy and promote goodness. And when our rules break relationship, begin to categorize and judge other people, then we shouldn't have those rules. Those are the rules that.
Well, my question about that then is, what about the Sabbath? Because nobody follows that, but it's a rule. I mean, just thinking about Mark's sermon a couple of weeks ago, going back to that, like, how is that different? Because that's one of the 10 commandments.
Yes, and you should have a Sabbath.
Does anybody today?
Well, I have a Sabbath.
But like, is it? Well, it's kind of mercurial how it looks on a person-to-person basis, though.
Right. I mean, I think Paul's pretty clear that that's the way the Sabbath is.
So, what kind of a Sabbath are we called to do? Like, because what are there specific?
We're called to rest.
You just thank you. Yeah. Well, we're called to rest, but like that can mean a lot of different things. So it's just
And that's okay.
It's an individual. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, I think for me, coming here, even though I work, this is part of my Sabbath. I'm resting with you guys. I'm worshiping with you. I'm leaning into who Jesus is with you. That's my Sabbath. Part of my Sabbath.
Some of the rules are that we have for other people are easy for us to keep.
Yes.
Like, I have a rule that my daughter doesn't jump on the couch, like you were saying earlier. That's an easy rule for me to keep because I don't have any desire to get up and jump on the couch. But I have to, I'm encouraging my daughter to follow that rule is a lot different.
Right.
Anyway.
And that's a relational rule probably, and to keep her safe.
Yeah, about the Sabbath thing. One thing I was reading, might have been yesterday, it was Jesus saying, when people were asking him, like the Pharisees or whatever were asking him, you just cured this guy on the Sabbath. You know,
Right.
you're working on the Sabbath, and I think his exact wording was something like, "The Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath," which
Yes,
I interpreted that to basically mean is that these, like, kind of like what you were saying a few minutes ago. It's like the rules are meant to promote like good living for people in communities, and maybe those rules apply most of the time, but there's exceptions, and maybe we shouldn't put the rules over the end goal of the rules, which is to promote good, wise, moral living.
and yeah,
Yeah. And sometimes that means doing something nice for someone on the Sabbath.
right. Yeah, I would agree, and I think, yes, the Sabbath is a place to promote relationship with Jesus and to be about Jesus's work. So that may be, It's good. I mean, that's a good conversation. But this is the conversation they were all in: is what makes the Sabbath, what should you can't do, what you know can do. And Jesus is like, well, it's relatively logical. If a guy has a crooked hand and I can heal him, I'm not going to wait till Sunday. I'm going to do it because there's Sabbath on Saturday or whatever, Saturday night. I'm going to just heal him. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And so I think that's a important part of that. I think we have to be really careful, because I think the rules, I mean, there are wise and good rules of God, both in the Old and New Testament, that we're to follow. But it's when it's our rules that separate us from one another and create division that God is not creating. And we do that, I think, a lot.
And I think that's true. I think we want to create communal rules, right? Rules for the community, not just rules for ourselves, because then we feel safe, and then it also gives us a chance to feel superior if we keep them. And if we don't keep them, then we feel bad about ourselves. I think in keeping Sabbath, like by the strictest rule, even if we went with Sunday is now the Sabbath, well, that's the day we work, right? So we're pastors, but I think pastors are notorious for not taking time off, and I've insisted that they have to do that. Like, when I mentor or walk with them, it's like, what does your day off look like, right? Do you shut off your phone? Do you not, like, are you so important that you have to take every call? Because then you can never be on Sabbath. And I think what happened was, the Pharisees had created communal rules, and it gave them a position of status and allowed them to judge whether people were in or out. And I don't think that's the invitation. And I think Peter's right. It's tough for me to have my own rules and then enforce them on myself, because I'll make easy rules. I'm not going to jump on the couch. Right.
Mark said that.
Yeah. Right. And instead of making really tough rules for myself of honoring God on the Sabbath.
Yes. I think, like, my son is learning to drive, and he was talking about, well, his mother has lots of rules for him, and I have lots of rules for him. They are actually not rules that are in the driving manual. They're rules on how you turn right. They're rules on, how you brake. They're rules. They're the sleeping car rules. Like, my mother had a rule, and that rule was she did not want to know that we had stopped when we stopped. So I had to, there can be no back. Okay? So that rule is passed on to my daughter and to my son. It's the tradition to the moral driving law that she does well with that. But he was commenting on how this all applied to his driving. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, go back to the point that after it sounds like Jesus semi-insults his disciples by asking if they're really this dull. In fact, what he's doing is very kind.
Yeah.
Because he, after telling them in black and white that it's what's in their heart that makes them unclean, he goes back and he explains that in different ways to help them understand. And I think, for me, one of my rules, and my wife who's watching the live stream is probably going to back this up, is that you must understand and love how righteous I am when I'm being righteous. Right? And if you don't, that makes me really angry. But in a way, God has that rule for himself. And we see that in Ezekiel, where he says, I'm going to replace your heart of stone with a heart that not only knows my law, but loves my law.
Right.
Like, God's rule is that you know and love his law, and they don't, right? What makes them unclean is that they don't love his law.
Right.
And so I would have been super triggered if I were Jesus in that situation, and my disciples are like, what are you talking about? Like, are you kidding me? Because they clearly don't know and love him and who he is and, God's law. So, the fact that he just stops and he's like, okay, we're going to talk more about this. And, for me, that looks like the rule of grace.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that, Ron. Well, I will close. I like that. And I'll just kind of move that into this closing of, I think the invitation is for us to own the fact that we do have an inclination to lie, to covet, to have other gods, to establish ourselves this way and produce those rules. And that really all these different encounters with Jesus that we've been looking at has been inviting us to be vulnerable, to say, I can't do this. I need you to help me, right? I need you to help me step into loving your law and loving you. I think that's a big part of it, is being willing to just say, okay, I need you to do this. So thank you guys for interacting with me. Oh, we got a question. Tamaki agrees with Ron. We will announce that on the internet. All right. I won't make a joke about that. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much just for this group of people here and everybody online and this morning, and just the interaction around your scriptures and the way that it pushes us to be more like you, to love your law, and to really love one another and not allow our rules to separate ourselves, but to really embrace you and each other. So I ask you to help us do that in your holy name. Amen.